Somewhere in the Arabian Sea, in the middle of the 19th century, an officer of the watch stepped to the rail of a British merchant vessel and found that the ocean had disappeared. Not in darkness, not in fog. The night was clear enough to see by, and what he saw in every direction simultaneously was a surface that had ceased to behave like water. It lay flat and uniform and white, the color of snow on an open field, extending outward from the hull to every horizon without variation or boundary. The sky above was dark, the sea below was not. There was no line between the water and the distance where the water ought to end. There was no flicker, no movement in the light, no response from the surface as the ship's bow continued to press through it. Just the steady, sourceless, patient whiteness of a sea that had become, for reasons the officer held no framework to explain, something else entirely. He would have checked his compass. The accounts suggest this, that the first response of a trained navigator confronted with that transformation was not wonder, but practical assessment, the reach for an instrument, the check of a position chart, the confirmation that the ship was still where it was supposed to be. The compass would have been steady, the ship would have been on course, the ocean simply would have been white. His logbook entry from that night survives in the way that logbook entries survive, carefully lettered, noted in the particular shorthand of a man trained to record what he observed without embellishment, and containing somewhere in its lines a phrase that does not resolve into any of the categories a practical man keeps for unusual weather. The sea appeared as a vast plain of snow. The glow extended to every visible horizon. It did not diminish through the watch. That entry is one of approximately 235 credible reports of the same phenomenon, gathered from 4 centuries of maritime logbooks, company archives, and voyage narratives by a researcher named Stephen Miller at the Naval Research Laboratory. 235 reports across 400 years of ocean travel, fewer than one per year, on average across all the ships that ever crossed the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea and the waters around Indonesia, not common enough to become routine, present enough to have been recorded, in nearly the same language, in nearly the same register of careful disorientation, from the 17th century to the 20th. The phenomenon has a name. Sailors have been calling it the Milky Sea for as long as they have been writing about it, and the name, as names go, is among the more accurate ones assigned to anything found in the natural world. The sea, when this occurs, is the color of milk. It is the color of chalk dissolved in water. It is the color of a very old photograph of snow. What it is not, and this is one of the first things worth setting down clearly, is the same as the bioluminescence most people have encountered or heard described along coastal shorelines. In a surf zone where dinoflagellates such as Noctiluca scintillans are present, the light is reactive. A breaking wave produces it. A hand drawn through the water at night produces it. The movement of a boat hull through coastal shallows produces brief blue-green sparks and trails, each one a tiny organism responding to mechanical disturbance by releasing a flash of light. That kind of bioluminescence is beautiful and familiar enough to have names in dozens of coastal languages, and it works like a response, the ocean answering a disturbance with a brief, scattered brightness. A Milky Sea is nothing like this. It does not flash. It does not respond to wave disturbance or the movement of a hull through the water. A ship sailing through it does not intensify it or alter it in any way that witnesses have recorded. The light is continuous. The light is uniform. It covers the surface without variation, from one horizon to another, and it persists through the movement of the water and the passage of hours without dimming or brightening or shifting in any particular direction. It is not reactive. It simply is a steady, enormous, sourceless glow that the ocean produces by some mechanism that when the British merchant officer was writing his logbook entry and checking his compass had not yet been named or identified or explained. The geographic distribution of the phenomenon is not random. The northwestern Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, the waters around the Socotra archipelago, the coastlines that belong today to Somalia and Oman, is the most documented Milky Sea region in the world. If the 235 reports gathered by Miller's research team were plotted on a map, the greatest density would fall there, in that warm northwestern quarter of the Indian Ocean, where the seafloor is deep and the surface water in certain seasons reaches temperatures that encourage specific things to happen in the water column. Secondary concentrations of sightings appear near Indonesia and in the Java Sea, also warm, also bounded by coastlines that were heavily trafficked by European merchant shipping across 4 centuries of documentation. The Socotra archipelago sits at the mouth of the Gulf of Aden, where the Arabian Sea begins to narrow toward the Red Sea, and its rocky coastlines look out over water that has, on some clear, quiet nights, undergone the same transformation that the British merchant officer recorded from his rail. The island chain is remote and geologically ancient, its endemic species isolated by its position in the middle of a warm ocean, and the water beyond its furthest reef can appear on an ordinary night as any deep tropical sea appears, dark and deep and reflecting whatever light comes from the sky. The change, when it comes, is not sudden. The accounts suggest it begins at the edge of visibility, a slight paleness in the water at the limit of what the eye can resolve, a whitening of the horizon that might first be mistaken for the beginning of dawn or the edge of a low cloud bank. Then it continues. Then it becomes, eventually, the thing that experienced navigators wrote down in their logbooks in the language of snow and milk and fire. The Socotra region is not a dangerous stretch of water in the way that certain straits and capes are dangerous. It is trafficked and known, and has been for millennia, a waypoint on the routes that connected the Mediterranean world to the Indian subcontinent and the Persian Gulf, long before the British East India Company or the Dutch VOC were sending ships through those latitudes. The sailors who wrote down the earliest European accounts of the Milky Sea were not sailing unknown waters. They were sailing routes their companies had used for decades, through waters that had been charted and logged and described in enough detail that any unusual event would stand out against a background of the expected. This is part of what gives the logbook accounts their particular quality. They are written by people who knew exactly what the sea was supposed to look like, and who noted, with the care of professionals, that it was not doing that. Individual Milky Sea events, the historical records indicate, can last for a single night. They can also last for several consecutive days. There are accounts in which a ship's officer, writing his entry at the conclusion of the watch, notes that the glow has now persisted through 3 complete watches, 12 hours, the full dark period of the night, without any discernible change in intensity or extent. There are accounts suggesting the phenomenon continued across successive nights, the ship moving through the same whitened water on the second night as it had on the first, the sea unchanged beneath a sky that had moved through its full rotation and returned to dark. Some events appear to have been brief. Some events appear to have been continuous across more than 72 hours of watches, each one dutifully recorded by whoever was standing at the rail when the next turn came. The persistence is one of the details that distinguishes the Milky Sea from almost any other unusual meteorological or oceanic event a sailor might encounter. A strange cloud formation shifts and dissipates. An unusual wave pattern changes as the wind changes. Phosphorescence in a surf zone follows the rhythm of the waves and the movement of whatever is swimming in the shallows. The Milky Sea does none of these things. It simply continues across the full duration of whatever time a ship requires to traverse it, or, in the longer events, beyond that, persisting after the ship has cleared the edge of the illuminated area. The logbook entry for the following night, noting that the water behind them remained white as the vessel moved on. In 2019, a satellite detected one of these events from orbit. The detection was made possible by a sensor called the Day/Night, band aboard a spacecraft called the Swissingly National Polar Orbiting Partnership Satellite, which is capable of measuring light intensities far below what previous generation instruments could register. And the image it returned when the data was processed showed a pale, softly luminous patch spread across the surface of the Arabian Sea off the Horn of Africa, a glow too faint for ordinary observation from altitude, resolved by this instrument into a coherent, mappable form. The research team that analyzed the data published their findings in 2021, and the area they had measured was approximately 100,000 square kilometers. 100,000 square kilometers of ocean surface, uniformly lit by a glow rising from within the water, comparable in total area to the land surface of Iceland, drifting slowly across successive nights of orbital passes in a manner consistent with being carried by surface ocean currents. This is the scale of the thing. This is what the British merchant officer was standing at the rail of his ship, looking at, without any way of knowing how large it was, or how far it extended beyond what his eyes could reach. From the deck of a ship, the horizon in clear conditions is roughly 15 to 20 kilometers away. That is the extent of the visible ocean from that height. The Milky Sea event that the Suomi satellite measured was, at its widest, many times larger than what any single witness could see. The officer with his compass was standing at the center of something whose full dimensions exceeded anything he had an instrument to measure, inside an event that a satellite, 150 years in his future, would require several nights of consecutive orbital passes to fully trace. The Arabian Sea in the images is dark around the edges and pale at the center of the bloom, the luminescent patch sitting within the larger darkness of the surrounding ocean like a very soft, very diffuse light source seen through deep water. It does not have sharp edges. The boundary between the lit area and the unlit water is gradual, the sea paling slowly as a ship approaches from outside the event, the darkness returning slowly as a ship moves through the other side. This matches the accounts. The logbook entries do not describe a sudden transition, a line the ship crosses from dark water to white. They describe something that begins at the edge of what is visible and grows steadily until it is everywhere. What the event leaves behind, when it ends, is nothing. This is the other detail that the accounts and the subsequent research establish clearly. A Milky Sea does not leave a mark. It produces no residue on the water's surface that persists after the glow has subsided. It leaves no physical alteration of the sea that a ship passing through the same area the following month would be able to detect. It does not discolor the water in daylight. It does not produce anything visible in the absence of the glow itself. When the event ends, when the bacterial population that drives the light disperses or diminishes below the threshold at which it can sustain a visible illumination, the sea becomes what it always is in that location. Dark water, ordinary water, water that gives no indication that anything has occurred in it. What remains afterward is only what was written down. The logbook entry from the 1860s in its careful hand. The VOC record from 2 centuries earlier in the Dutch of a company clerk who had never studied biology and had no category for what the officer described. The entry from the SS Lima in 1995, with its coordinates and its sea condition descriptions and its precise account of 6 hours of passage through water that was uniformly white to every visible horizon. These documents are not residue in any physical sense. They are not marks on the water or changes in the composition of the sea. They are marks on paper, or the digital equivalent, produced by observers who had no explanation to offer and offered none, only the record of what they saw and when they saw it, and what the instruments read at the time. 235 of these records, gathered from archives in the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and the United States, spanning from the early 17th century to the modern era. Fewer than one credible account per year across the full span of systematic European ocean travel. Not because the phenomenon is rare in the sense of occurring seldom, the satellite data suggests it is more frequent than that, but because the conditions required to observe and document it are specific. A ship must pass through the illuminated area at night, in clear enough conditions to see the glow, with an officer on watch, literate enough and attentive enough to note it in the log, and the log must survive the subsequent centuries and find its way into an archive that a researcher will eventually search. Most Milky Sea events, if the satellite data represents the actual frequency, probably occurred in ocean areas no ship was crossing, or on cloudy nights when the glow would have been invisible from a ship's deck, or in the tracks of vessels whose logs did not survive or were never systematically archived. The 235 are the ones that made it through all of that. They are the survivals. Each one is a coincidence of geography and clear weather, and the presence of a ship, and the presence of a careful observer, and the preservation of paper across decades or centuries. And each one describes, in language that varies in vocabulary, but not in essential description, the same thing. The sea turned white, the horizon disappeared, the glow extended in every direction simultaneously without any visible source or center. The compass was checked. The position was confirmed. The log was written. The phenomenon did not wait for observation. It was not performing. The bacterial populations that produce it, and that is the mechanism, precisely, though the full elaboration of how that works belongs to another part of this account. We're not responding to the presence of ships, or the gaze of officers, or the movement of pens across logbook pages. They were doing what they do in the warm water of the Indian Ocean, in the specific conditions that allow a population to reach the density at which this particular light becomes visible. And the light was there, whether anyone was watching from a deck or not. The ship sailed into it. The ship sailed through it. The ship sailed out the other side, and the logbook entry was written, and the ocean continued. This is the particular quality the accounts share across all 4 centuries of them, the sense that what was observed was entirely indifferent to observation, not hostile, not welcoming, not performing or signaling or responding in any way to the human presence that happened to be passing through it. The Milky Sea was occurring in the way that the Arabian Sea is warm in August, and the upwelling carries cold water to the surface in the monsoon season, and the currents run in the directions they have always run. It was occurring, and a ship was there, and an officer stood at the rail and looked at it, and then went inside and wrote it down. The Socotra Archipelago, on the nights when the water beyond its outermost reef begins to pale at the horizon, has no way of knowing it is doing so. The water temperature is what it is. The organic matter in the surface layer is what it is. The bacterial population invisible in the warm, dark water, is building towards something, or has already crossed whatever threshold it needs to cross, and the glow, somewhere in the middle distance from the furthest visible rocks, is either beginning or already fully underway. The islands are dark, the water around them is dark, and beyond the reef, in the direction that is not the direction of land, the sea is white, steadily and entirely white, holding its light against the night with the same patience it has always held. Everything, tides, weather, the long, slow movement of the currents across the basin. The light does not flicker, it does not shift, it does not respond to the wind that moves across it, or the swells that pass through it, or the weight of the darkness above it. It is continuous and uniform, and it persists through the hours of the night with the same quality of stillness that the rest of the ocean has. It is simply, in addition to being an ocean, lit. A ship's officer in that position, standing at the rail with his compass in his hand, the whitened sea extending from the hull to every horizon, without exception, the sky dark above, and the water bright below, would have had no landmarks, and no gradients, and no visual cue to suggest which direction was which, or how far the glow extended. The compass would have told him where north was. The chart would have told him where the ship was. Nothing would have told him where the edge of the illuminated area was, or how many hundreds of kilometers of white water the ship still had to cross before the ordinary darkness of the sea returned. He would have noted the time in the log. He would have noted the heading. He would have written down, in the careful professional shorthand of a man trained to describe what he observed, that the sea appeared as a vast plain of snow, and then the watch would have continued, and the ship would have continued, and the ocean would have continued, white and still and patient and entirely, quietly, its own thing. The satellite image of the 2019 event shows the bloom as a pale softness on the water off the Horn of Africa, the luminescence diffuse and gradual at the edges, concentrated and more distinct at the center of the mass. Across several nights of consecutive orbital passes, the image shows the patch drifting slowly west and south, carried by the surface currents, its shape changing slightly as the nights pass in the way that any fluid thing changes shape when it is carried by moving water. The research team that analyzed the images traced 45 consecutive nights of this movement before the glow finally subsided below the threshold the sensor could resolve. 45 nights, 6.5 weeks of a 100,000 square kilometer patch of ocean glowing continuously in the dark. In the 1860s, a merchant officer would have crossed some portion of that. He would not have known its full dimensions. He would not have known how long it had been glowing before his ship arrived at its edge, or how long it continued after his ship cleared the far boundary. He would have known what he saw from the rail for the duration of his crossing, which might have been a night or 2 nights or 3, and he would have written that down, and the ship would have continued on its heading toward wherever it was going. The event itself, the full 45 nights of it, the 100,000 square kilometers of it, existed independently of the crossing. The officer's logbook entry is a small window cut into the side of something much larger than the window reveals. The window is all we have. The window and the fact that on the other side of the glass the glow simply continued, in the dark on the water for longer than any one ship's passage through it could have shown. What is left, when it is over, is nothing physical. The ocean returns to itself. The bacterial population that produced the light disperses or subsides. The warm water remains warm. The currents continue. If another ship were to pass through the same area the following week, the sea would be dark, and the officer on watch would see dark water, and the logbook entry would contain nothing unusual because there is nothing unusual to record. No residue, no discoloration, no lingering luminescence visible in daylight or through any instrument a ship carries. The event occurred, and the event ended, and the ocean is simply ocean again. What survives is not the event itself, but the record of it. An entry in a logbook, written in a careful hand, noting the date and the position and the condition of the sea, noting that the glow persisted through 3 consecutive watches without diminishing, noting that the water appeared as a vast plain of snow, noting that the compass was checked and the position confirmed, noting that the glow extended to every visible horizon simultaneously. The logbook entry was closed. The log was stored. The voyage continued. The ocean did not mark the occasion of having been seen. This is the particular quality of absence that the Milky Sea leaves behind, not the absence of something that was there and is gone, in the way that a storm leaves debris, or a wreck leaves remains, or a fire leaves ash. The absence of a Milky Sea is simply the return of normal water, water that is doing what water does, in a place where water was recently doing something else, and now shows no sign of having done so. The only verification that it occurred at all is the words in the logbook, written in a careful hand by an officer who stood at a rail and looked at a white ocean and wrote down what he saw. The words persist. The ocean does not preserve them. The ship moved on. The event ended, and the sea, in whatever part of the Arabian Sea the bloom had occupied for those weeks or days or nights, resumed the darkness it had before, quiet and indifferent and wide, the same water it has always been, holding nothing of what happened in it except the temperature, which is always warm in that season, and the currents, which are always running in those directions, and the specific invisible populations of the water column, which are always there in some quantity, doing quietly what they do, in the warm, dark ocean, in the middle of the night, somewhere in the warm surface water of the Arabian Sea, on a night in late summer when the air has been still for days, and the water temperature has held above 25 degrees Celsius for weeks, a single bacterium releases a molecule into the ocean around it. The bacterium is a rod-shaped cell, approximately 2 micrometers in length. Roughly 500 of them laid end to end would span a single millimeter. The molecule it releases drifts outward into the water column, one signal among an uncountable number, part of a slow chemical conversation that has been accumulating since before the surface of the sea began to whiten. That single cell is Vibrio harvii. It lives throughout the tropical and subtropical ocean, distributed across warm water zones from the Arabian Sea to the waters around Indonesia, present in concentrations that fluctuate with temperature, nutrient availability, and the presence of organic matter in the surface layer. On most nights, in most places, it is invisible, not because it is hiding, but because the conditions for what it is capable of producing have not yet converged. The molecule it has just released into the water is called an autoinducer. It is a small chemical signal, specific in structure, designed to be recognized only by other cells of the same species. And in the water around this single bacterium, there are millions of other cells already doing the same thing, releasing the same signal, waiting for the same threshold to be crossed. The distance between one Vibrio harvii cell and the ocean surface it will eventually help illuminate is difficult to hold in the mind all at once. The cell is 2 micrometers across. The surface area that a mature Milky Sea event covers can reach 100,000 square kilometers, a pale, softly luminous expanse, the size of Iceland, visible to a satellite passing overhead at an altitude of more than 800 kilometers. Between the scale of a single cell and the scale of that illuminated ocean, There is a relationship that is neither metaphorical nor approximate. It is precise, biological, and the result of a mechanism that operates the same way every time it operates, in every cell in the bloom, across the full breadth of warm water where the conditions have aligned. That mechanism begins with chemistry, and it begins quietly. The light that an asterisk Vibrio Harvii asterisk cell produces does not come from the cell itself in the way that heat comes from a flame. It comes from a reaction, a specific controlled enzymatic oxidation that releases energy, not as heat, but as a photon of visible light. The enzyme responsible for this reaction is called luciferase. It is a protein folded into the particular shape that allows it to bring together its substrates and catalyze their conversion, and it is encoded in the bacterial chromosome by a specific set of genes whose structure and function have been mapped with considerable precision. The substrates the enzyme acts upon include a long-chain fatty aldehyde, molecular oxygen, and a reduced form of flavin mononucleotide, abbreviated FMNH2, which serves as the electron donor that drives the oxidation forward. When luciferase brings these three components together, the reaction proceeds. The aldehyde is oxidized, and energy is released. That energy does not dissipate as warmth into the surrounding water. It exits the cell as light, a single photon, blue-green in color, at a wavelength of approximately 490 nanometers. 490 nanometers. This is the color of a clear, shallow tropical sea in daylight, that specific blue-green that appears when sunlight passes through 10 or 15 meters of warm, sediment-free water and reaches a pale, sandy bottom. It is, perhaps not coincidentally, one of the wavelengths that seawater transmits most efficiently, which means a photon produced at depth travels upward with relatively little absorption. In a bacterial bloom dense enough to qualify as a Milky Sea event, the combined output of billions of cells producing photons at this wavelength becomes a sustained uniform glow, steady rather than flickering, continuous rather than responsive, distributed evenly across the surface rather than concentrated at any particular point. The ocean surface, seen from a ship in the middle watch, appears white. It is not white. It is a pale, luminous blue-green, the precise color of a luciferase reaction, completing itself in a rod-shaped cell, 2 micrometers long, repeated simultaneously across a volume of water so large that no single observer can see its edge. The enzyme that produces this light does not run continuously in all asterisk Vibrio Harvii asterisk cells at all times. This is the detail that makes the Milky Sea possible at the scale it achieves. If every cell in every warm ocean produced light all the time, the phenomenon would be background noise, a diffuse, faint, ecologically meaningless glow distributed so widely that no single location would ever become bright. Instead, the cell regulates its own light production in response to the density of the population around it. The enzyme is present in the cell, the substrates are available, and the genes that encode the enzyme are there in the chromosome, but the genes are switched off. They remain silent until a specific chemical signal tells them the time has come. The genes that encode the luciferase enzyme and the proteins associated with its function are arranged together in the bacterial chromosome in a unit called the asterisk lux, asterisk operon. An operon is a cluster of genes regulated as a group, controlled by a single promoter sequence that either allows transcription to proceed or suppresses it. The asterisk lux asterisk operon in asterisk Vibrio Harvii asterisk contains 5 genes, asterisk luxa asterisk lux B asterisk lux C and asterisk lux E asterisk, each encoding a different protein component of the bioluminescent system. Asterisk luxa asterisk and asterisk lux B asterisk together encode the two subunits of the luciferase enzyme itself. Asterisk lux C asterisk, asterisk lux D asterisk, and asterisk lux E asterisk encode the enzymes responsible for synthesizing and recycling the fatty aldehyde substrate the luciferase enzyme needs to function. The 5 genes are arranged in sequence. They are transcribed together. When the promoter is activated, all 5 are read and translated as a unit, not individually, not in stages, but simultaneously, as though a switch has been thrown across the entire operon at once. For hours, sometimes for days, in a developing bacterial bloom, the asterisk lux, asterisk operon, sits silent. The cells are dividing, the population is growing. The conditions that favor growth, warm water, abundant organic carbon, dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus in sufficient concentrations, are accumulating and holding, but the light does not begin. The operon waits. What it waits for is a number. The process through which asterisk Vibrio Harvii asterisk measures its own population density and uses that measurement to regulate its behavior is called quorum sensing. The word quorum, in its ordinary usage, refers to the minimum number of members required for a deliberative body to conduct official business, the point at which there are enough participants present that the group can act collectively rather than as a collection of individuals. In asterisk Vibrio Harvii asterisk, the same logic applies. Translated into chemistry, each cell continuously produces and releases small signaling molecules into the water surrounding it. These molecules, the autoinducers, accumulate in the environment as the population grows, because each cell contributes to the accumulating signal in proportion to its own presence. The concentration of autoinducers in the water at any given moment is a direct reflection of how many cells are present in that location. When the concentration is low, the population is small. When the concentration is high, the population has grown to the point where collective action becomes meaningful. Asterisk. Vibrio Harvii. Asterisk uses not one, but 3 parallel quorum sensing circuits simultaneously. Each circuit uses a different autoinducer molecule, produced and detected through a different molecular pathway, but all 3 circuits converge on the same target, a master regulatory protein called LuxR. LuxR is the transcriptional activator that, when present in sufficient quantities and in its active form, binds to the promoter region of the asterisk lux asterisk operon and initiates transcription. 3 separate chemical signals arriving through 3 separate detection pathways all feed into the activity of this single protein. The architecture of this arrangement has drawn considerable attention from microbiologists interested in signal integration, the way that multiple independent inputs are weighted, combined, and translated into a single output. But its most important feature, for the purposes of what appears on the surface of the Arabian Sea, is its threshold behavior. Threshold behavior means that the response to a signal does not scale smoothly with signal strength. It does not produce a little light when autoinducer concentrations are a little high, and more light when they are a little higher. The system has a switching point, a specific concentration of autoinducers at which the accumulated signal through all 3 circuits tips the activity of Luxor past the level required to activate the asterisk lux asterisk operon. Below that concentration, the operon is silent. At and above it, the operon is active. The transition between these 2 states in a well-mixed population at the threshold is rapid. And because every cell in the population is measuring the same water, responding to the same accumulated autoinducer concentrations, and governed by the same threshold in its own Luxor proteins, they cross the threshold together, not sequentially, not gradually, together. In the hours before the crossing, the water is dark. The cells are present, billions of them, in every cubic centimeter of the surface layer, but the operon is silent and the luciferase enzyme is not being produced. The population continues to grow. Autoinducer concentrations continue to rise. The three signaling circuits continue their accumulation, feeding into Luxor, approaching the point at which the protein's activity will exceed the activation threshold. And then, across the full extent of the bloom, across tens or hundreds of square kilometers of warm surface water, the threshold is crossed. The asterisk Lux asterisk operons activate. The luciferase enzymes are produced. The fatty aldehyde substrates are synthesized, and the cells begin to emit light. This is not an event that anyone on the surface of the sea above witnesses as a transition. By the time a ship enters the luminescent water, the glow is already present and already uniform. There is no edge where the light begins and the darkness ends, or if there is, it is too subtle to see from a deck. The bloom is simply there, and the ocean is simply white, as though it has always been white, and the darkness before was the anomaly. Inside each glowing cell, the luciferase reaction is completing itself continuously. The enzyme binds its substrates, the long-chain aldehyde, the oxygen, the FMNH2, the oxidation proceeds, the photon releases, and the aldehyde is converted to the corresponding fatty acid, which must then be reduced back to the aldehyde form by the enzymes encoded by asterisk Lux, asterisk Lux D asterisk, and asterisk Lux S, asterisk before the cycle can run again. The cell is not burning, it is not consuming itself. It is running a carefully managed metabolic cycle that produces light as a byproduct of controlled oxidation, recycling its own substrates, sustained by the energy and nutrients available in the warm, organically rich water around it. The reaction is exquisitely efficient compared to combustion. Almost all of the released energy goes into producing the photon, and almost none goes into heat. The water does not warm, the sea does not change temperature, nothing burns. The sustained quality of the glow, its continuity, its evenness, its refusal to flicker is a direct consequence of this metabolic steadiness. Luciferase reactions completing themselves in billions of cells, each one running on its own internal rhythm, but averaging out across the population into a smooth, uniform output. No cell is synchronized with its neighbors at the level of individual reaction cycles. Each cell's luciferase is completing its reaction at its own pace, constrained by the local availability of substrates and oxygen. But the average output across billions of cells is constant, the same quantity of photons per second per square centimeter of ocean surface, hour after hour, through the watches of the night. The conditions that allow a asterisk Vibrio harvii asterisk population to reach quorum density in open water are specific enough to confine the phenomenon to a relatively narrow geographic and seasonal range. Sea surface temperatures need to be above 25 degrees Celsius, warm enough to support the metabolic rates required for rapid bacterial cell division, and warm enough to indicate the presence of the low wind, low mixing conditions that allow surface bacteria to remain concentrated rather than dispersed into the water column. The water also needs to carry high concentrations of dissolved organic carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, the nutrient substrates that fuel bacterial growth. In an open ocean environment, concentrations of this kind typically accumulate in association with phytoplankton blooms, which fix nitrogen and carbon during their growth phase and release dissolved organic matter into the surrounding water as they senesce and decompose. The bacterial bloom and the phytoplankton bloom it feeds upon are linked, one following from the other, with the patience of a biological sequence that has been running in tropical oceans for an extremely long time. Calm sea conditions matter too. Vertical mixing, driven by wind, by surface cooling, by wave action, disperses the surface layer, diluting the bacterial population and the autoinducer concentrations it has accumulated. A storm that interrupts a developing bloom will set the quorum sensing clock back, spreading the cells and their signals into a larger volume of water, reducing the autoinducer concentration below the threshold, and silencing the asterisk lux, asterisk operon again. The Milky Sea requires stillness. It requires warmth. It requires an accumulation of organic matter rich enough to sustain explosive bacterial growth. It requires, in other words, the particular convergence of conditions that the northwestern Indian Ocean produces reliably during and after the southwest monsoon season: warm surface water, phytoplankton productivity, and the relative calm that follows the monsoon's active phase. The geography of the phenomenon is not accidental. It reflects the geography of the conditions that make it possible. The Arabian Sea in August is, in this sense, a prepared surface. The water temperature is high. The nutrient concentrations in the surface layer have been elevated by monsoon upwelling. The phytoplankton blooms that fed on that upwelling are in the later stages of their productive season, and the organic matter from their partial decomposition is present in the water column in concentrations that support dense bacterial growth. Somewhere in that warm, still, organically rich surface layer, a dasterisk Vibrio harvii dasterisk population has been doubling, not dramatically, not visibly, but steadily through the preceding days and nights. The autoinducer concentrations in the water have been rising. The three signaling circuits have been accumulating their inputs. Luxor has been approaching its activation threshold. The cell that released its autoinducer molecule into the Arabian Sea at the beginning of this account was one of that population. Its signal joined the accumulated signals of the billions of other cells releasing the same molecule into the same water, one molecule among billions, one contribution to a concentration that was, in the hours before the glow began, already very close to the threshold. It is worth following the scale of this precisely because the distance between the molecule and the ocean surface is one of the most striking features of the phenomenon, not because it is mysterious, but because it is so thoroughly accounted for. The autoinducer molecule is a small organic compound, nanometers in diameter, weighing a few hundred atomic mass units. The ocean surface it will help illuminate is 100,000 square kilometers of warm water. Between those two scales lies nothing supernatural, nothing that resists examination, only chemistry and biology and the specific logic of a regulatory system that has been selected for over evolutionary time because populations that can coordinate their gene expression across cell density thresholds outcompete populations that cannot. The asterisk lux asterisk operon, in that light, is not an oddity. It is a solution. It is the specific arrangement of 5 genes that allows a bacterial population to invest in the metabolic cost of producing light only when the population is large enough for that light to serve whatever function it serves. Whether that function is attracting organisms that the bacteria can colonize, discouraging predation by larger cells, or generating some other advantage that is still being worked out by the researchers who study these systems in warm tropical water. The operon is old. The quorum sensing circuits that regulate it are old. The luciferase enzyme itself is old, its structure conserved across distantly related bioluminescent organisms in a way that implies a single evolutionary origin for the light-producing reaction, carried forward through hundreds of millions of years of diversification into the precise molecular configuration that a Vibrio harvii cell runs tonight in the surface layer of the Arabian Sea. The fatty aldehyde cycle runs. The FMNH2 donates its electrons. The oxygen molecule completes the oxidation. The photon leaves the cell at 490 nanometers, moving upward through the dark water toward the surface. Billions of other photons leave billions of other cells in the same instant. Not the same instant, literally. Each cell running its own cycle at its own pace, but the same instant averaged across a population large enough that individual variation disappears into a smooth, continuous output. The photons reach the surface. They leave the water. Above the surface, in the still, warm air of an August night over the Arabian Sea, the light is visible. It is visible to the naked eye from a ship's deck. It is visible, faintly, as a spatially coherent anomaly in the ocean surface radiance to a satellite 800 kilometers overhead. It is not visible to the individual cell producing it, which has no sensory apparatus for detecting its own output, no awareness of the population of which it is part, no knowledge of the ocean surface it is illuminating. The cell is simply running its chemistry. The *lux* operon is simply transcribing its genes. The luciferase enzyme is simply catalyzing its reaction. The light simply exits the cell and travels upward, joining the light of every other cell in the bloom, becoming the phenomenon, the white, still, continuous glow that extends in every direction simultaneously, that persists through the watches of the night without dimming, that leaves a ship's officer standing at the rail without a horizon to orient by. One of the quieter aspects of the quorum sensing system is that it does not require any individual cell to know what the collective is doing. The cell releases its autoinducer into the water not because it has decided to signal, but because the synthesis of the autoinducer molecule is part of its ordinary metabolic activity, proceeding continuously as a function of its internal biochemistry. The molecule enters the water. It diffuses. It joins the accumulated pool of identical molecules released by every other cell in the population. At some point, the pool reaches a concentration that allows enough Luxor activation to drive *lux, operon transcription, not in one cell, not in a selected few, but in any cell whose internal Luxor concentration and activity reflects the same external autoinducer concentration the whole population is experiencing together. There is no coordinator. There is no signal sent from one cell to the others, telling them the threshold has been reached. There is only the shared chemistry of the water they all inhabit, reflecting back to each cell the same information about the density of the population, and each cell responding individually to that information in the same way, because they are all the same organism, running the same regulatory logic, governed by the same threshold. The collective behavior, the simultaneous activation of the *lux, operon across the full population, the lighting of the bloom, is not directed. It simply emerges from the fact that every cell is doing the same thing at the same time, in the same water, waiting for the same number. In the moment the threshold is crossed, across the surface of the Arabian Sea, in a volume of warm water that covers more square kilometers than the land area of Iceland, The asterisk lux asterisk operons switch on. Not most of them, not gradually, spreading from a center outward. All of them, wherever the autoinducer concentration has crossed the threshold, in every cell that has been waiting in the dark water with its luciferase genes silent, and its aldehyde cycle ready, and its autoinducer pool approaching the point of activation. All of them together. The sea does not gradually brighten, the chemistry does not ease toward the threshold and then slowly cross it. The population reaches quorum, and the light begins, distributed, uniform, continuous, across the full extent of the bloom, from its center to its furthest edge, as though the ocean surface has simply decided, all at once, to begin emitting the color of a clear, shallow sea. In the still air above the water, on a night with no moon and no cloud, and no wind to break the surface into reflecting facets, the glow is steady and wide. It does not flicker. It does not pulse. It does not respond to the passage of a ship or the movement of a wave. It simply persists because the cells that produce it are still dividing, still running their chemistry, still releasing their autoinducers into the water around them, still holding the population above the quorum threshold that keeps every asterisk lux, asterisk operon in every cell switched on. There is something precise about this image, the collective, coordinated ignition of a bacterial bloom across thousands of square kilometers of ocean, achieved without any central control, without any single cell directing the rest, through nothing more complicated than the accumulation of a small organic molecule to a specific concentration in warm seawater. The precision is not imposed from outside. It is interior to the system. It is what the system does. 5 genes in a cluster, a regulatory protein with a threshold, 3 parallel signaling circuits feeding into the same activator, and from that arrangement, light, steady, blue-green, continuous, vast, the asterisk lux asterisk operon switches on across the full population, and the Arabian Sea glows, and the glow does not know what it is, and the cells do not know what they have made together, and the ocean does not stop being warm and still and full of organic matter dissolved in the dark water beneath the surface. The chemistry simply runs, and the light is produced, and somewhere in the warm, still darkness above the luminescent sea, the night continues without anything disturbing it. On a night in late July 2019, the day/night band sensor aboard the swimming MPP satellite completed an orbital pass over the Arabian Sea. It was not looking for anything unusual. The sensor was doing what it always did, scanning the ocean surface in long, careful sweeps, measuring the faint radiance of a dark world from 424 miles above it. What the data showed, when the research team at Colorado State University examined the imagery the following morning, was a pale luminous patch in the waters off the Horn of Africa, faint enough that an earlier generation of instruments would have recorded it as noise and moved on. This sensor did not move on. It held the signal, resolved it into a coherent shape, and placed that shape on a map of the Arabian Sea as clearly as a coastline. The SWOMI NPP satellite had been launched in October 2011 as a joint project between NASA and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and among its several instruments, the day/night band sensor was the one designed specifically for detecting low-light phenomena at the ocean surface. Previous satellite sensors had been sensitive to light intensities in a range that made them adequate for tracking lit coastal cities and monitoring large fire events. The day/night band was different. It was capable of detecting light intensities approximately 1,000 times fainter than those earlier systems could register. 1,000 times. The difference between what a match produces and what a candle produces is negligible compared to that gap. The day/night band was built to see things the ocean produced in the dark that no instrument had ever resolved from orbit before. Moonlit wave crests, the reflected radiance of a sky not quite dark, the faintest edge of a city's light bleeding over the horizon and reaching the water. It was this sensitivity, accumulated carefully and incrementally across years of engineering work, that made it possible to see a bacterial bloom glowing in the Arabian Sea from 424 miles away. The research team that examined the July 2019 data was led by Stephen, the 500th, Miller of the Cooperative Institute for Research in the Atmosphere at Colorado State University. Miller had spent years studying what low-light satellite imagery could reveal about the ocean surface. He understood the day/night band's capabilities as well as anyone, and he understood what kinds of signals it produced when the ocean was doing something that required attention. When the Arabian Sea imagery from late July came in, and the pale patch appeared in the radiance data, he knew what he was likely looking at. The patch was spatially extensive. It did not move the way reflected moonlight moves. It did not shift its geometry as the satellite's angle changed, did not ripple or fragment at the edges. It sat on the water surface with the settled quality of something that was generating light from within rather than bouncing it from above. It covered an area that, when the team measured it carefully, proved to be in the range of 100,000 square kilometers. That number requires a moment to sit with. 100,000 square kilometers. The land area of Iceland is approximately 103,000 square kilometers, which makes Iceland a useful reference for the scale of what the day/night band had found floating in the Arabian Sea. Iceland is not a small island. It contains glaciers and interior highlands and coastal fjords, and a capital city, and a geology so active that parts of it are still technically being created. The luminescent patch in the Arabian Sea was roughly the same size, and it was not land, it was ocean surface. It was open water, warm and dark, glowing from below with a pale blue-white light produced by a bacterial population that would never appear in any census and had no name outside of its taxonomy. The satellite image showed this area as a coherent, softly luminous shape against the surrounding darkness of the sea, not blazing, not dramatic, but unmistakably present, unmistakably large, and unlike anything the surrounding ocean produced. Miller's team did not immediately publish what they had found. The scientific process does not work that way. What they had was a satellite image showing an anomalous radiance signature. What they needed before they could claim to have documented a Milky Sea event was corroboration, an independent account from someone who had been in those waters on those nights and could describe what they had observed. The satellite image established that something was producing light at the ocean surface. It could not, by itself, establish that the light matched the historical descriptions of the Milky Sea phenomenon. For that, the team needed a witness. The corroboration came from a sailing yacht called the Ganesha *. In late July and early August of 2019, the Ganesha * had been sailing through the Arabian Sea, and the crew had passed through waters that began at some point during the passage to glow. They filed a detailed written account of the experience. The account described the water around the yacht becoming gradually brighter, the glow deepening over time until the sea in every direction appeared uniformly luminous, a pale white light extending to every horizon with a consistency that did not waver as the yacht moved through it. The crew noted the sea conditions, calm, warm, the air still. They noted the duration of the passage through the illuminated water. They noted the approximate position. They wrote it down carefully, as mariners have always written things down, because a sea that produces its own light in the middle of the Indian Ocean in late July is the kind of thing that deserves a careful record. When Miller's team matched the Ganesha's account to the satellite data, the two records aligned with the precision that researchers look for and do not always find. The position coordinates the crew had noted placed the yacht inside the luminescent patch that the day/night band had imaged on the same nights. The dates corresponded. The description of the glow, its uniformity, its extent, its pale quality, was consistent with what the satellite radiance signature indicated. An experienced navigator's handwritten account and a digital sensor's radiance map, produced independently by two entirely different kinds of attention, were describing the same patch of ocean on the same nights. The match was clean enough to constitute, in Miller's assessment, the first confirmed satellite detection and documentation of a Milky Sea event. The paper was eventually published in 2021 in Scientific Reports, but the documentation work did not end with the identification of the event. Miller's team had access to the full archive of nightly satellite passes over the Arabian Sea from the period in question, and they had something more valuable than a single confirmed sighting. They had a sequence. They had every night's imagery from the same region across the full duration of the bloom. What those sequential images showed, laid side by side, was a luminescent patch that did not remain in one place. It drifted. Night after night, the pale shape in the radiance data appeared in a slightly different position, the whole pattern tracing a slow, westward movement across the ocean surface that was consistent with a bacterial colony being carried by surface currents rather than propelling itself. It was not moving with any intention. It was simply going where the water went, the bloom and the water inseparable, the glow persisting through the drift. The team tracked this movement across 45 consecutive nights. 45 nights of orbital passes, each one showing the luminescent patch still present, still glowing, still covering an area comparable to Iceland, still carried slowly westward by the current. The beginning of the 45-night record and the end of it were separated by a distance in the Arabian Sea that a ship under sail would take days to cover. The bloom had not dissipated. It had not fragmented into smaller patches that dispersed across the wider ocean. It had held together as a single coherent illuminated mass through the entire period, drifting with a kind of patient consistency that made the watching of it, even in the abstract form of sequential radiance maps, feel like observing something with a long and settled persistence to it. 45 nights. The same bacterial population, or something continuous with it, producing the same light across a month and a half of warm Arabian seawater. The sequence of nightly images arranged in order produced something that a single photograph could not, a record of movement. Each image showed the patch in a slightly different position. The cumulative record showed the direction and speed of the drift. Researchers studying ocean current patterns in the Arabian Sea could look at the trajectory the bloom had traced across those 45 nights and recognize in it the line of expected behavior of surface water in that region during the summer monsoon season, the same currents that carry warm water westward, the same predictable pattern that has shaped the ocean surface in the northwestern Indian Ocean for as long as there has been a monsoon and an ocean. The bacterial bloom was following the water was following the wind. The whole enormous illuminated mass was drifting through the Arabian Sea in the way things always drift through the Arabian Sea in August, which is to say slowly, steadily, and without apparent interruption. A researcher working through the 45-night sequence would find themselves paying attention in a particular way, not to any single image, but to the slight displacement of the patch from one night to the next, the accumulated shift of a shape that was both enormous and within the scale of an ocean, entirely unhurried. The attention required was the kind of attention that produces a different quality of understanding than a single striking image does. One photograph of a luminescent patch the size of Iceland in the Arabian Sea produces a kind of immediate comprehension of scale. 45 photographs, each one showing the same patch a little further west, produce a different understanding, the understanding that this was not an event, but a duration, a period of time in which the sea held its light across weeks of nights, moving with the current, present every time the satellite passed overhead, still there, still faintly glowing, still not done. The 45-night record also raised a question that the satellite data could not fully resolve. When had the bloom begun, and how long had it been glowing before the first image that captured it? The earliest image in the sequence was not necessarily the bloom's first night. It was simply the first night the data happened to show it. The bloom might have been producing light for some time before that initial detection. Similarly, the final image in the sequence was not necessarily the night the bloom ended. It was the final night the data clearly showed it, before the signal became ambiguous, or the imagery conditions changed. The actual duration of the event might have been longer, perhaps considerably longer than 45 nights. The data established a minimum. The true extent of the event remained, like most things observed from the necessary distance of orbital altitude, partially open. This uncertainty was, in a way, one of the things that made the satellite detection most interesting to Miller's research team. They had confirmed the event. They had documented the drift. They had established the scale with reasonable precision and matched it to an independent eyewitness account. And at the same time, they had demonstrated that satellite observation of the phenomenon was capable of capturing only a portion of a bloom's lifespan, the portion that coincided with clear orbital passes and sufficient instrument sensitivity, and a research team alert enough to notice the faint signal in the data. The Milky Sea was now, definitively, something that could be detected and tracked from space. It was also something that remained partly beyond what the detection system could fully resolve. After the Asterisk Scientific Reports Asterisk paper appeared, Miller's team returned to the archive. Specifically, they returned to the years of historical satellite data that had been collected and stored before anyone had thought to search it for Milky Sea signals. The Suomi MPP satellite had been operational since 2011. Its day/night band had been producing nightly radiance maps of the ocean surface for the entire period since launch. All of that data existed. All of it had been stored. Very little of it had been searched specifically for the faint, spatially extensive radiance signature that would indicate a bacterial bloom of the Milky Sea type. The team searched it now, working back through the archived passes, applying to historical data the same analytical attention they had brought to the 2019 event. What they found was 9 additional events, 9 probable Milky Sea occurrences in historical satellite data that had been collected, stored, and not examined for this purpose. Events that had been passively recorded from 424 miles above the ocean surface and had been waiting in the archive in the form of radiance numbers attached to geographic coordinates and calendar dates. The bacterial blooms had glowed. The satellite had passed overhead. The data had been written to storage. No one had looked at those particular files for this particular signal. And then, years later, someone did look, and the events were there, in the record, each one a faint but coherent luminous patch in the warm tropical ocean, each one occupying a position in the northwestern Indian Ocean, consistent with the known geographic distribution of the phenomenon. 9 events. Across a dataset spanning several years of archived nights, 9 separate occasions on which the Arabian Sea, or surrounding tropical waters, had produced a Milky Sea, and no one on land had known it while it was happening. Some of those events may have been observed by vessels passing through the area. There may be logbook entries or voyage reports from those periods that have not yet been matched to the satellite record. Crew accounts filed with shipping companies or harbor masters that describe a glowing sea in the Indian Ocean on a night that corresponds, within the uncertainty of position and date, to one of those 9 archived events. The matching work has not been completed. The records have not all been searched. The connection between the archived satellite signal and any contemporary eyewitness account for most of those 9 events has not been made. That incompleteness is worth staying with for a moment. The satellite archive of probable Milky Sea events represents one kind of record, remote, precise, instrumentally obtained, stored in a retrievable digital form. The maritime record of eyewitness accounts represents another, personal, immediate, written in handwriting by someone who was present in the water and whose attention had been caught by something the ocean was doing. The 2 records have, in the case of the 2019 event, been brought into alignment with considerable care and satisfaction. For the 9 recovered archival events, that alignment has not yet been achieved. The satellite record exists. The possible eyewitness records may exist somewhere. The connection between them, if it is there to be found, is still waiting. The broader implication of those 9 recovered events was that the phenomenon was somewhat more frequent than the rarity of documented human sightings had previously suggested. 4 centuries of maritime logbook records had produced approximately 235 credible sighting reports, fewer than one confirmed report per year, on average, across the full span of European deep-water sailing. That number had been understood as an indication that Milky Seas were genuinely uncommon, events that occurred rarely enough that most sailors could spend an entire working life at sea without encountering one. The discovery of 9 additional events in a satellite archive spanning only a handful of years did not contradict the rarity of human sightings. What it suggested, instead, was that human sightings were themselves a sparse and incomplete record of how often the phenomenon actually occurred. The Milky Sea was not more common than sailors had reported. It was more common than sailors had seen. This makes a specific kind of sense when the geography of the phenomenon is considered carefully. The northwestern Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea, the waters around Socotra, the sea lanes approaching the Horn of Africa, is a large region, and not all of it is traversed by vessels whose officers keep detailed logbooks. The shipping lanes concentrate human observation along specific corridors, a bacterial bloom forming in open water, well away from those corridors, might persist for weeks without any vessel passing through it. The bloom would glow. The satellite would record it. No logbook entry would be made. The event would join the category of things that happened without human witness, which is a large and quiet category that contains most of what the ocean does. The question of how often Milky Seas occur in waters that no ship crosses in the relevant period is, by its nature, unanswerable through any form of maritime record. It can only be approached through instruments that do not require a human observer to be present, and the day/night band sensor on the Suomi NEMPP satellite is, at present, the most capable such instrument that exists. It passes over the Arabian Sea nightly. Its data is being collected and stored. The archive grows with each orbital pass. Each night's radiance map added to the record that preceded it, each one potentially containing the faint signal of a bloom that the ocean produced in the dark. On a night when no vessel happened to be near enough for a watch officer to lean over the rail and see the water glowing beneath the ship, Miller's team also considered what it would take to increase the reliability of Milky sea detection from orbit. The day/night band is sensitive, but it is not infallible. Cloud cover obscures the ocean surface. Moonlight interferes with the detection of faint luminescence by raising the overall radiance baseline against which the bacterial glow must be distinguished. The atmospheric conditions over the Arabian Sea during the southwest monsoon season, the same season that most Milky Sea events occur, are frequently hazy, with aerosol loading that reduces the clarity of the satellite's view. A bloom that was glowing on a heavily overcast night would not appear in the day/night band data, regardless of its size. The 9 events recovered from the archive were the ones that had occurred on nights clear enough for the sensor to see them. The total number of events during the archive period was unknown and likely larger. This does not undermine the achievement of the 2019 detection. It contextualizes it. The detection was real. The tracking was precise. The cross-referencing with the *Ganesha* account was careful and methodologically sound. What it produced was something that the maritime logbook record alone could never have produced: a measurement, not just a description, a measurement. The bloom covered 100,000 square kilometers. It persisted for at least 45 nights. It drifted in a direction and at a speed consistent with known surface current patterns. These are numbers. They exist now in the scientific literature in a form that can be compared with future events, incorporated into models of ocean surface biology, referenced by researchers studying bacterial bloom dynamics or Indian Ocean climatology. The Milky Sea had moved, over the course of that 2021 paper, from the category of reported phenomena into the category of measured ones. That is a particular kind of transition, and it is not a small one. The research team had done, in a sense, what research teams do when the evidence cooperates. They had taken something that generations of sailors had observed and described and wondered about, something that had accumulated in archives and logbooks across 4 centuries of maritime culture, and they had brought it into the specific, exact light of instrumental measurement. The bloom had been seen, it had been sized, it had been tracked. The data sat in a published paper in a scientific journal, and the phenomenon it documented was still occurring, still drifting through the warm tropical oceans, still visible from orbit on nights when the sky was clear enough and the sensor sensitive enough and the research team attentive enough to notice what the data was showing. The Ganesha's crew had sailed through the bloom in late July and early August, and they had written down what they saw. The Suomi NPP satellite had passed overhead on the same nights and recorded the radiance. Miller's team had brought those 2 independent records into alignment 2 years later in a Colorado State University office on a screen showing a false color radiance map of the Arabian Sea. The image the crew of the Ganesha had described from inside the bloom, water glowing white in every direction, the sea surface uniformly luminous, the glow extending to every visible horizon, was the same image the satellite had captured from above, a pale, coherent, spatially vast radiance signature sitting in the warm water off the Horn of Africa, covering an area the size of Iceland, holding together through the nights. When Miller returned to the historical satellite archive and found those 9 additional events waiting in the data, the implication was quietly significant. The archive already existed. The data had already been collected. The 9 events had already occurred, already been passively recorded, already been stored in the form of radiance numbers in files with dates attached. No further observation was required. No new satellite passes were needed. The events were simply there, in the record, having waited in the archive for the specific attention that was now being brought to them, the same patient attention that the ocean itself seems to have, glowing quietly in the dark, on nights when no instrument is watching, and on nights when one is. The 9 events found in the archive do not exhaust the archive. The day/night band has continued to collect nightly ocean surface radiance data every pass since the discovery was published. The archive continues to grow. Each night's data is stored, cataloged, available for retrieval and analysis by any researcher with the relevant access and the specific question to ask. The question of how many Milky Sea events are present in that growing archive, how many pale, spatially extensive radiance signatures are sitting in files that have not yet been searched for this particular signal, does not have a current answer. The answer is somewhere in the data. It is a number. It is waiting to be found, the way the 9 events were found, by someone working carefully backward through nights the ocean had already passed through, looking for the faint and patient glow of something the sea produced in the dark and a satellite recorded without being asked. The Arabian Sea does not know it is being watched. The bacterial blooms form and drift and disperse according to conditions that have nothing to do with the instruments orbiting above them. The water temperature rises with the summer. The monsoon drives cold, nutrient-rich water upward from the depths. The surface layer fills with organic material. The bacteria find it and multiply in the dark, reaching the density at which their collective light becomes a measurable thing, a thing that can be sized at 100,000 square kilometers and tracked across 45 consecutive nights and matched to a sailor's handwritten account and published in a journal and searched for in historical archives and found again in 9 additional instances already waiting in data that had been sitting in storage for years without anyone looking at it for this. The events were there. They had always been there. The archive was patient. The data was complete. 9 glowing seas in the warm tropical ocean, each one unobserved from any deck, each one recorded from above, each one waiting quietly in its file, like a logbook entry in a very specific kind of hand, not handwritten, but just as particular, just as careful, and just as available to the right kind of attention at the right kind of time. The Suomi NPP satellite is still operational. Its day/night band sensor is still passing over the Arabian Sea on its nightly orbits. The data from each pass is still being collected and stored, each file containing a night's worth of radiance readings from the ocean surface, each one potentially holding the faint signature of a bloom no ship has sailed through, on a night no watch officer will remember, in water that glowed for no audience but the instrument, and keeps glowing, quietly and without interruption, until the bacterial population disperses back into the warm, dark water it came from, leaving no mark, and the satellite passes over again before dawn, its sensors still open, still measuring, the data still arriving. Somewhere in a maritime archive, in a folder of documents that has been handled many times over 4 centuries, there is a sentence written in Dutch. It describes the sea. The officer who wrote it was experienced. He had made multiple passages through the Arabian Sea and the waters east of it. He knew the ordinary behavior of tropical ocean at night, and he was not given, from the evidence of his other log entries, to embellishment or imaginative excess. What he wrote down, in the careful hand of a man recording what he had observed rather than what he felt, was that the sea had turned to white fire extending across the full breadth of the visible horizon. The phrase does not read as exaggeration. It reads as the effort of a precise man to put into available language something that available language did not quite fit. White fire, not white water, not phosphorescence, not the ordinary flashing of a disturbed tropical sea. Fire and white, which fire is not, which is perhaps what made the word necessary. The full breadth of the visible horizon, not a portion of the sea ahead of the bow, not a glowing wake behind, but everything the eye could reach in every direction at once. This was a Dutch East India Company vessel, probably in the mid-17th century, somewhere in the waters that now appear on charts as the Arabian Sea or the waters around present-day Indonesia, and its officer of the watch had spent some part of the night standing at the rail, looking out at an ocean that had become something he did not have an existing category for, and he had done the only thing available to him. He had written it down. That sentence has survived in an archive for close to 4 centuries. The officer who wrote it died long before anyone could tell him what he had seen. His ship eventually completed its passage, returned to port, and was absorbed into the ordinary record of VOC trade routes and cargo manifests. The entry sits in the log among navigational notations and weather observations, a single departure from the routine that the routine had been insufficient to contain. The sea, he wrote, had turned to white fire. And then the watch had ended, the glow had remained, or had not remained, and the ship had continued east. It is worth staying with that image for a moment, not for what it suggests about the unknown, but for what it documents about the experience of a working navigator confronted with something outside his working vocabulary. He was not on a voyage of discovery. He was not a naturalist or a philosopher, or a man disposed to record impressions of the ocean surface for their own interest. He was an officer of a commercial fleet, responsible for the safety of a vessel and its cargo, and he had taken the time, in the middle of whatever watch this was, to write down that the sea had turned to white fire, because the alternative, not writing it down, letting the watch end, and the glow simply go unrecorded, was apparently not possible for a man who kept careful records. The thing had happened. The thing had to go in the log. What the thing was could perhaps be determined later by someone else, somewhere else, with better information than he had. That determination took approximately 3.5 centuries. What other navigators wrote down, in the years and decades that followed, began to accumulate into a pattern, though not one that anyone was specifically collecting at the time. British merchant vessel logbooks from the Arabian Sea in the 1850s and 1860s contain descriptions that the VOC officer would have recognized immediately, the water appearing as a vast plain of snow, white as milk in every direction simultaneously. The horizon not visible because the sea and the sky had both become pale, or rather because the glow was so uniform and so sourceless that the ordinary contrast between a dark sea and a lighter sky above it had been erased. These were experienced mariners. Several of the accounts note that the officer making the entry checked his compass, not because he feared the glow itself, but because the visual disorientation of having every directional reference removed, no shadow, no dark water ahead or behind, no horizon to orient against, made position feel less certain than it had been before the glow began. The compass, of course, still worked. The charts were still correct. The ship was exactly where it had been before the sea turned white. The disorientation was not navigational, but perceptual. The ordinary cues that allow a navigator to feel located, to feel that the ocean surrounding the ship is simply the ocean surrounding the ship, had been replaced by something that did not behave like an ocean, a vast plain of snow, one account reads. Another writes of milk. Another, more precisely, more helpfully, notes simply that the water appeared to produce its own light, uniformly and without variation, from every point of the surface visible from the deck, and that this condition had persisted without diminishing through the entirety of the watch. These men were writing carefully. They were writing what they observed. They did not know what they had entered, and they did not pretend to. What is consistent across these 1850s and 1860s logbooks, across the accounts of different vessels on different passages in different years, is not only the visual description, the whiteness, the uniformity, the absence of flicker or response to wave motion, but the secondary behavior it produced. Experienced officers checking instruments they trusted, men pausing in the act of writing to note that the glow persisted through an entire watch, and then continuing to write, a quality of attention that the ordinary passage through the Arabian Sea at night had apparently not required, but that this required the careful notation of what the eye was seeing, in case what the eye was seeing turned out to matter. One account from this period is specific enough to be worth dwelling in. The glow had begun at some point during the first watch of the night. The precise time of onset was not recorded, which itself suggests it came on gradually, the way something that builds from below a threshold of notice tends to come on, without a clear moment of beginning. By the middle watch, the officer writing the entry notes, the sea was uniformly bright to every horizon, and the ship appeared to move across a surface of light rather than water. He describes going to check his position chart, not because anything was wrong, but because the visual experience of the ship's surroundings had ceased to resemble any previous visual experience of the ship's surroundings, and the chart was a way of re-establishing that the ordinary coordinates of the world still applied. They did. The ship was where it should have been. The ocean was still the ocean. The glow persisted for the remainder of the watch, 4 hours more, and was still present, unchanged, when the next watch came on to relieve him. That the glow was unchanged is a detail that recurs, not fading, not shifting, not brightening, simply present as it had been when the first watch began, as it would apparently continue to be through whatever watches followed. One logbook entry from this era notes explicitly that the luminescence persisted without dimming or shifting through 3 complete watches, 12 hours, and that when the officer who had first noted it came back on duty at the end of that period, the sea was still white in every direction. What he had written down at the beginning of his watch remained an accurate description of what he found at the beginning of the next one. This quality of persistence, of the glow neither announcing its arrival with a sharp onset, nor departing with any visible diminishment, is one of the things that distinguishes the written accounts from what might be expected of a phenomenon someone had embellished or misremembered. People who are embellishing tend to add drama. The Milky Sea, as it appears in these logbooks, is consistently, almost stubbornly, undramatic. It is there. It does not do anything. It does not respond to the passage of the ship through it. It does not produce any sound. It does not vary by weather or wind. It is simply there, white, uniform, extending to the horizon in every direction, and then, at some point not always recorded, in some logbooks, simply absent from the next watch's entry, without comment. It is no longer there. Jules Verne was writing his novel about an undersea voyage in the 1860s, at roughly the same time as the merchant vessel officers were making these entries. He was working in Paris consulting the naturalists' reports and maritime records available to him, and he included in his narrative a scene in which his narrator observes the ocean surface transformed to white light. Verne attributed the glow to infusoria, a term current in his period for microscopic aquatic organisms, used loosely enough to accommodate a range of things his science did not yet distinguish. The detail is interesting, not as evidence of what Verne knew, but as evidence of what was known, what had accumulated in the scientific and popular consciousness by the 1860s, sufficiently to find its way into a novel whose readers were expected to accept it as plausible scenery. The Milky Sea was real enough by Verne's period to need no special introduction in a work of scientific fiction. It was part of the recognized vocabulary of the deep ocean, listed among the known strangeness of tropical waters. Verne did not invent it. He found it in the record and put it in his book, and his readers, presumably, recognized it. The record it came from was already old by then, and it continued to be added to. The pattern that emerges across the full span of documented sightings from the VOC logs of the mid-17th century through the British merchant vessel accounts of the 19th century and forward into the 20th is one of consistency in the essential characteristics described independently by observers who had no access to each other's accounts across more than 4 centuries of seafaring in the same geographic regions. The sea turns white. The glow is uniform. It does not flicker. It extends to every horizon. It persists. It is silent. That last element, the silence, is one the logbook accounts tend to note almost incidentally, the way one notes the absence of something that would not ordinarily require notation. There was no sound. The sea, which ordinarily carries the continuous low background sound of water moving against water, of whatever wind is present, of the ship's own passage creating its own noise, the sea was quiet. The glow did not produce sound. There was no crackle or hiss, no disturbance, nothing to hear that corresponded to what the eye was seeing. A field of light in every direction, and no sound to go with it. Several accounts describe this specifically as more disorienting than the visual strangeness itself. A man who has spent years at sea has a calibrated relationship with its ordinary sounds, the weight and texture of silence at sea, the low register of wind and water that constitutes the background of a night watch. The Milky Sea, according to multiple independent accounts written in different periods by different men on different ships, produces a quality of silence that the visual experience amplifies into something more absolute than ordinary night silence. Not the absence of sound, exactly, but the presence of something so visually complete and so orally empty that the combination creates a particular kind of quiet, a stillness. These accounts suggest that is difficult to account for entirely by the ordinary mechanics of a calm night. One British officer writing in this period notes that he had sailed through severe storms without experiencing anything comparable to the quality of disorientation produced by the Milky Sea, not because the sea was dangerous, but because it was simply and completely unlike anything he had previously experienced. The storms had been frightening, he writes. This was not frightening. It was something else, something for which he does not offer a word, something that he circles by describing what it was not threatening, not alarming, not a portent of bad weather or mechanical difficulty, something that sat outside the usual categories of nautical experience entirely, occupying a different register, quieter, stranger, in a way he could not place, and entirely, perfectly, without precedent in his professional life. This account was written by a man at sea. He had a compass, he had a chart, he had a watch to complete, and a position to maintain. He wrote the entry, he presumably finished the watch, and the ship continued on its course. The glow, whenever it eventually ended, left no trace. The sea behind was the sea it had always been. The century that followed added to the record in a different way. The vessels were no longer wind-driven merchant ships, out of the Arabian Sea trade routes. They were steam-powered, then motor-powered. The instruments on their bridges were more numerous and more precise. The men keeping watch were trained differently. The logbooks, where logbooks were still kept, were denser with technical notation, and still in the waters of the Arabian Sea and the northwestern Indian Ocean, the glow appeared. Still, officers of the watch wrote it down. Still, the essential description was the same: white, uniform, silent, persisting, without a known explanation. In January of 1995, the British merchant vessel SS Lima was making a passage through the Indian Ocean when the officer of the watch noted that the sea had turned white around the ship. He recorded the position coordinates, he noted the sea conditions, he noted the time, and he noted that for 6 consecutive hours of that night passage, the water around the ship was uniformly white to every horizon, not flashing, not flickering, not responding to the wake of the vessel, simply present and complete and extending in every direction without diminishment. He filed a formal report. The report included the specific latitude and longitude of the event, the duration, and a description of the appearance of the water that was, in its essential elements, identical to the descriptions filed by merchant officers 140 years earlier. 6 hours, every horizon, white, uniform, without obvious cause. That report was later read by researchers. It became part of a larger analysis. The coordinates were cross-referenced with oceanographic data. The date was noted. The sea conditions at those coordinates on that date were examined against what was known about bacterial bloom conditions in that region in January. The report filed by the officer of the Lima became, decades after it was written, one piece of a larger puzzle whose other pieces, satellite imagery, bacterial sampling data, oceanographic temperature records, had not yet been assembled. When he was standing at the rail in January 1995, writing down his latitude and longitude and noting, carefully, that the sea was white, he had no more framework for what he was seeing than the VOC officer had had in the mid-17th century. He had better instruments and a more technically sophisticated training and a different vocabulary for the ocean and its behavior. The glow did not care about any of that. It was present for 6 hours. It was uniform and silent and white, and then at some point after the 6th hour it was gone, and the sea was the sea again, and the ship continued on its course. He wrote it down. It survived. There is a quality common to all these accounts that is easier to feel than to name. It is not the quality of fear, though some accounts come close to naming something like it. It is not the quality of wonder in its enthusiastic register. These men were not writing journal entries about sunsets. It is something closer to the quality of being in the presence of something that does not respond to any of the usual human ways of relating to an environment. The Milky Sea does not react to the ship passing through it. It does not dim or brighten in response to wind or wave. It does not produce sound. It does not require anything from the observer. It is simply there, vast and uniform, and continuing on its own terms, unaware, and apparently indifferent to the vessel making its careful way across it. This is what the officer of the Middle Watch in 1860 was writing about when he described checking his compass. Not because the compass might have been affected by the glow, it would not have been, but because the glow had replaced the ordinary visible structure of the ocean with something that offered no reference, no texture, no direction, no information about the relationship between the ship and the water. The sea, ordinarily, gives you things to read. Its color changes with depth. Its surface texture tells you about wind and current. The light on the horizon tells you where the sky ends. The Milky Sea removes all of that, replaces it with a uniform, sourceless white that extends to every horizon equally and changes nothing about itself in response to anything the ship does. The chart still said the ship was here. The compass still pointed north. The sea was still the sea, and it was white and silent and wide, and it had been white for 12 hours, and there was nothing to do but keep the watch and write it down. Across more than 4 centuries and more than 200 documented accounts, the people who encountered the Milky Sea did, consistently, that one thing. They kept the watch. They wrote it down. The VOC officer in the 17th century, the British merchant officer in the 1850s, the crew of the Lima in 1995, none of them could explain what they were seeing, and none of them pretended to. They noted the time, the position, the sea conditions, the appearance of the water, the duration of the glow. They filed their reports and completed their passages. The records they created were the only thing that would survive. The logbook entry from a vessel in the 1860s, 3 complete watches, 12 hours. The glow unchanged at the beginning of the watch that came after the one that had first noted it, was written by a man who was almost certainly tired and who had, in all likelihood, other things requiring his attention. He wrote it carefully anyway. The words are, by most accounts, the only evidence that the event occurred. No sample of the water, no photograph, no physical residue left behind by whatever had made the sea white. The glow, when it ended completely, without leaving anything in the water that a later observer could have identified as its cause. Only the words remained. Only the careful entry in a logbook in the handwriting of a man keeping a watch on a merchant vessel in the Arabian Sea, noting that the sea had been white for 12 hours and that there was no explanation he could offer for why. This is what is left of a Milky Sea after it is gone. Not a mark on the water, not a residue, not a physical trace of any kind that might anchor the event in something verifiable by later examination. Only the written accounts of the people who were present. Only the logbooks, the official reports, the occasional literary treatment, the filed observations of officers doing their professional duty by noting what they saw, even when what they saw did not fit the ordinary categories. The glow disperses. The water returns to its ordinary color and ordinary darkness. The bacterial bloom that produced the light does not leave anything visible behind. Whatever was there, in the sea, producing its quiet, continuous illumination across thousands of square kilometers of warm tropical water, is simply gone. The ocean is dark again, and the words remain. They remain in the archives, the VOC archive in the Netherlands, the British Maritime Records in London, the files of the various research institutions that have, in more recent decades, begun to compile and cross-reference what the logbooks contain. They remain in the writing of a researcher carefully going through maritime records one by one, extracting the accounts that meet the criteria for a credible sighting report. They remain in the collections of 2 centuries of naval officers who encountered something that did not fit the categories and did the one thing available to them. They described it precisely in the language they had, and they put it in the record, the full breadth of the visible horizon. A vast plain of snow, white as milk in every direction, uniformly white to every horizon for 6 consecutive hours. The glow persisted without dimming or shifting through 3 complete watches. These phrases, written in different languages, in different centuries, by different men on different vessels in different parts of the same ocean, form a coherent description of a single phenomenon, not because the writers were in communication, not because they had read each other's accounts, but because they were describing the same thing. The Milky Sea does not vary much in its essential appearance. It is white. It is still. It is vast. It is silent. It persists. What the sea looked like to those men, standing at the rail, or sitting at a chart table, or making their way across the deck in the middle of the night to check an instrument, that is something the words only partially recover. The language of the logbooks is functional and precise, the language of men recording facts. It does not reach for beauty or strangeness. It does not try to convey the feeling of standing at the edge of a ship in the middle of the Arabian Sea at 3 in the morning with the ocean white in every direction and no sound except the ordinary sounds of the ship itself, and nothing to look toward because every direction is equally, identically, quietly bright. The words record the fact of it, the feeling of it, what it was actually like to be there, is somewhere in the gap between the words and the thing they describe, the gap that all language leaves around anything genuinely unfamiliar, the gap that the VOC officer was working in when he wrote White Fire, which was not quite right, but was the closest available thing to write. The glow ended. It always ended. At some point during some watch, the brightness at the horizon thinned, or seemed to thin, or the officer simply noticed that the sea ahead was darker than the sea behind, and then the sea was dark, and the ship was in the ordinary dark ocean it had been in before the glow began. Nothing in the water marked the place where the glow had been. Nothing floated on the surface. The water was not different in temperature or color or texture from the water on any other night in the Arabian Sea. At this latitude, in this season, it was simply dark again and quiet, as it had been before, as it would continue to be. What remained was the logbook, the entry carefully made, noting the time and position and the quality of the light and the duration of the event. The careful hand of an officer completing his record of the watch, noting for the benefit of whoever read the log next, the captain, the company, the archive, that the sea had been white, and that it had persisted, and that it was now dark again, and that no explanation was available. That entry sits in the archive now, along with the others. The sea that produced it has long since returned to darkness. The bacterial bloom that made the water white has dispersed into the water column, leaving nothing visible. The ship that the officer stood on has been gone for more than a century, and the words remain, precise, quiet, inadequate in the way all words are inadequate to things encountered for the first time, but present and permanent in the way that written records are permanent, outlasting the ocean, outlasting the glow, outlasting the man who wrote them. The sea was white. It was still. It was silent. It was wide. It covered everything the eye could reach, in every direction, all at once, and it made no sound at all. In the Arabian Sea, in August, at the outermost edge of the southwest monsoon season, there is a particular kind of ending that happens almost without announcement. A phytoplankton bloom, one of the great productive blooms driven by cold water rising from the depths during the monsoon upwelling, begins, after days or weeks of abundance, to decline. The cells that built it have divided and divided again, drawn nutrients from deep water that the wind has pushed toward the surface, produced oxygen, captured light, multiplied in their billions across hundreds of square kilometers of warm tropical ocean, and then, quietly, the bloom begins to exhaust what it has been living on. The cells die in their billions. They sink, or they remain suspended at the surface, breaking apart. What remains of them, particulate organic carbon, fragments of cell walls, the dissolved residue of what was living and is no longer, drifts in the warm water and waits. It does not wait long. Bacteria have been present all along, in numbers so large that counting them is a matter of estimation rather than precision, moving through the same water column, following the chemistry of what is available. When the phytoplankton bloom declines and its organic matter becomes widely available, the bacterial population encounters conditions that allow for growth at a scale that has almost no parallel in the visible world. Dissolved organic carbon, dissolved nitrogen, dissolved phosphorus. Water temperatures above 25 degrees Celsius, stable and warm across the depth of the surface layer. Still air, low wind, the sea undisturbed by the kind of vertical mixing that would distribute the bacteria through the water column and dilute the population before it could reach the density it is moving toward. One thing becomes the conditions for another. The bloom ends. The bacterial bloom begins. It begins in the dark, and in the dark it will produce its own light. The particular quality of what happens next in the surface layer of that warm, still, nutrient-rich water is a matter of thresholds. A single bacterium of the species Vibrio harvii, a rod-shaped organism, gram-negative, distributed through tropical and subtropical ocean waters around the world, releases into the water around it a small chemical molecule, a signal, one among billions of identical signals being released at the same moment by neighboring cells through the same warm water. Each cell is monitoring the concentration of these molecules in the water immediately around it, and each cell is waiting for a specific threshold to be crossed, a concentration that tells the cell, with the particular precision of chemistry, that the population around it is dense enough, that the conditions are right, that the moment has arrived. This monitoring and signaling happens continuously, silently, in a medium the human eye cannot resolve into any individual event. It happens across a patch of ocean that may already cover thousands of square kilometers. It happens in the same water where the phytoplankton bloom recently ended, in the same water where the particulate organic matter is still drifting slowly downward, in the same warm, dark, still surface layer through which nothing visible is moving. The threshold is crossed across the population, not gradually, not in a spreading wave from some central point, but all at once, as a single act distributed across an enormous area of ocean. The *lux operon switches on. Luciferase is produced. The enzyme meets its substrate, meets oxygen, completes its reaction, and releases a photon of blue-green light at a wavelength of approximately 490 nanometers, the precise color of a clear, shallow tropical sea seen from below on a bright afternoon, multiplied by the number of cells in an active bloom, a number that is measured not in thousands or millions, but in quantities that require scientific notation to express. That single photon per cell, per reaction, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a glow, visible from a ship's deck. If you would so, from a sailor's logbook, from a satellite sensor in low Earth orbit, 700 kilometers above the ocean surface. What produces the Milky Sea, at its most basic level of description, is the chemistry of decomposition operating at an extraordinary oceanic scale, one thing ending and something else beginning inside the conditions that ending creates. The phytoplankton bloom dies. Its organic matter becomes the substrate for bacterial growth. The bacterial population reaches the density at which quorum sensing triggers collective light production. The ocean surface becomes luminous. The sequence is orderly and physical, driven by temperature and nutrients and chemistry, and it is also considered from the deck of a ship or the archive of a satellite image among the stranger-looking events that the ocean regularly produces. Squid arrive. This has been reported in multiple accounts of Milky Sea events with enough consistency that it has become part of the documented record of what these events look like from the surface. Squid are attracted to light at night, reliably, predictably, in the way that fishing boats in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific have used bright lamps hung over the stern for centuries to draw squid toward the surface. During an active Milky Sea event, the attraction is the same, and the squid respond accordingly, rising from the depths toward the luminous surface, clustering in the glow, apparently indifferent to the fact that the light is bacterial rather than artificial. They move in the water at the edge of the glow, and sometimes through it, and their presence in that light is one of the stranger-looking facts about the Milky Sea, a living, moving population of animals drawn to the surface by the collective bioluminescence of a bacterial bloom that stretches in some events across more ocean than the human eye can hold. The geographic concentration of Milky Sea events in the Arabian Sea is not arbitrary. The northwest basin of the Arabian Sea, the waters around Socotra, the coastline of Oman and Somalia, the open ocean between the Horn of Africa and the Indian subcontinent, is one of the most productive upwelling zones in the world, and its productivity is seasonal and driven by the monsoon. Between June and September, the southwest monsoon drives surface water away from the coast, and cold, nutrient-rich water from deep in the ocean rises to replace it. This upwelling fuels phytoplankton blooms of exceptional scale. Those blooms, when they end, produce the organic matter that supports bacterial growth. The water temperatures in this region during the peak monsoon season are consistently above 25 degrees Celsius. The conditions that produce milky seas are not unusual in the Arabian Sea in August. They are, in some sense, the normal late summer state of the water, given the right coincidence of nutrients and temperature and calm. The Arabian Sea generates the conditions for milky seas, the way certain valleys generate fog, not inevitably, not every season, but regularly enough that the phenomenon has been documented there across 4 centuries of maritime records, and is likely to have been observed there for much longer. The Hindu cosmological text known as the Vishnu Purana describes among the 7 oceans that surround the known world, one called the Kshira Sagara, the ocean of milk, in the cosmology of which it is a part. This ocean is not an ordinary sea. It is the medium in which creation operates at its deepest level, the vast white still body of water across which gods and demons pull a cosmic serpent wrapped around the mountain at the center of the world, churning the ocean to produce Amrita, the nectar of immortality. The image is of an ocean that is uniformly white, motionless, extending without horizon to every side, existing outside the ordinary terms by which the ocean is understood. Researchers studying the Milky Sea have noted the visual resemblance between this image and a documented Milky Sea event in the Indian Ocean, an ocean so uniformly luminous that it has no visible horizon, no shadow, no dark patch, no direction of greater or lesser brightness. The Vishnu Purana does not explain itself in oceanographic terms. What the ancient authors were describing, if they were describing anything they or their sources had encountered, cannot now be confirmed. What can be noted is that the Indian Ocean is the primary region of Milky Sea occurrence, that the phenomenon has been producing encounters with unexplained white oceans in that water for at least as long as human beings have been sailing it, and that the image of a vast, still white sea is precise enough in the cosmological tradition to suggest it was drawn from something that had at some point been seen. The resemblance between the Kshira Sagara and a Milky Sea event is offered by researchers as an observation rather than a conclusion. It is held at a careful, interested distance, the kind of distance that notes a pattern without overclaiming what the pattern means. The overlap is real and documented, whether it represents ancient coastal or maritime communities encountering bioluminescent seas and finding in the encounter the terms for something vast and cosmologically significant is a question that the archive does not answer. It simply remains open, like many of the questions that gather around this phenomenon, patient and quiet and without resolution. Stephen Miller's database of Milky Sea sighting reports sits in the research literature of current oceanography as an active reference, not a closed archive, not a historical curiosity, but a working document. The approximately 235 reports it contains were drawn from maritime archives in the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and the United States, spanning from the early 17th century to the modern era. Each entry represents an account filed by someone who was there, a ship's officer, a watchstander, a navigator writing down what the sea was doing in the middle of a night passage through the Arabian Sea or the Java Sea or the waters off the Horn of Africa. The accounts differ in length, in the precision of their position coordinates, in the duration of the event they describe, and in the language the writer reached for when trying to set down what was in front of them. What they share is the basic fact of a sea that was white and glowing when it should have been dark, and the attempt to describe that fact in language that could be passed forward to the next port, to the company's office, to an archive where it would eventually be read by a researcher who recognized what it was. The database is still open to new entries. If a credible account arrives, a contemporary position-verified sighting with sea condition data, or an archived logbook not yet incorporated into the record, it can be added. The research is ongoing. The ocean is still producing the events that the database documents. In the northwest basin of the Arabian Sea, in the weeks after the monsoon upwelling reaches its peak, the surface water holds a particular density of dissolved organic matter. It holds warmth, a surface temperature consistently above 25 degrees Celsius across the full depth of the upper mixed layer, warmth that has been accumulating since May and will persist into October. It holds the residue of the phytoplankton blooms that the upwelling drove into existence in June and July, particulate carbon sinking slowly from the surface, dissolved carbon remaining in suspension, nitrogen and phosphorus in concentrations that bacterial populations can metabolize at the rate required for the kind of explosive growth that Milky Sea conditions represent. All of this is present in the same water, in the same season, in the same part of the ocean where the earliest documented European accounts of glowing seas were set down by Dutch East India Company navigators in the mid-17th century, and where the British merchant officers of the 1850s and 1860s stood at their ship rails, looking out at an ocean that had, in every direction they could see, become white. The ocean that those navigators stood over is the same ocean, the chemistry is the same, the bacterial species is the same, the threshold mechanism, quorum sensing, autoinducer molecules accumulating in warm water until the asterisk lux asterisk operon fires simultaneously across the population, is the same mechanism that was operating in the water under the hull of the SS asterisk Lima asterisk in January of 1995, and under the hull of the sailing yacht asterisk Ganesha asterisk in late July and early August of 2019. The phenomenon that the Vishnu Purana may have been drawing on, the phenomenon that the Dutch navigator wrote about as white fire extending across the full breadth of the visible horizon, and the phenomenon that the day/night band sensor of the Suomi NPP satellite resolved into a coherent, mappable form in 2019, are the same phenomenon. It has been occurring in the same region of ocean for as long as the conditions that produce it have been present in that region, and those conditions are not recent. They are the normal late summer state of an ocean that has been warm and productive and seasonally upwelling for a very long time. What is less certain is how often it happens. The satellite work published in 2021 suggested that the phenomenon is somewhat more frequent than the rarity of human sightings had implied. The 9 probable Milky Sea events identified in historical satellite archives were events that had already occurred, already been recorded in the data, and simply not been recognized for what they were when the data was first examined. The detection threshold of the day/night band sensor on the Suomi MPP satellite is approximately 1,000 times more sensitive to faint light than the sensors on previous generation satellites. At that sensitivity, the faint but spatially vast radiance of an active Milky Sea event becomes not just detectable, but clearly mappable, its edges defined, its drift across the ocean surface trackable over consecutive nights. At the sensitivity of sensors available before Suomi MP's launch in October 2011, the same events would have been below the detection threshold, invisible in the data, indistinguishable from the noise of ordinary ocean surface radiance. They would have occurred. They would not have been seen. There are likely to be events in the historical satellite record that have not yet been found. The archive of ocean surface radiance data collected by satellite sensors over the past several decades is not exhaustively cataloged for this particular faint signal. The 9 events identified by Miller's team were found through a specific retrospective analysis, and they were found because the team knew what pattern to look for: a faint, spatially coherent, persistent radiance at the ocean surface in the tropical zones where bacterial bloom conditions are most likely to be present. There may be events in the archive from years before the analysis was conducted, recorded in data that was collected for other purposes and has not yet been examined for this signal. They would be there in the data, waiting in the same way that the 9 identified events were waiting, already having occurred, already stored, the light they produced already translated into numbers on a server somewhere. The squid that rise toward a Milky Sea's surface on a warm August night in the Arabian Sea do not have an account of the experience. What the event looks like from beneath the surface, from the perspective of an organism moving upward through water that is becoming progressively more luminous as the bloom density increases toward the surface, is a matter of inference and hypothesis rather than direct observation. What is documented is the presence of the squid, their clustering near the surface during active events, their attraction to the same wavelength of blue-green light at approximately 490 nanometers that the *Lux Operon produces. The light is real, and the squid respond to it. Whether *Vibrio harveyi, produces bioluminescence, partly as a mechanism for attracting host organisms. Squid being among the organisms that the bacteria colonize is a hypothesis that the evidence is consistent with. The evidence does not confirm it. The question is open. The open questions in the science of the Milky Sea are not the kind that suggest the phenomenon is poorly understood in any troubling sense. The basic mechanism, bacterial quorum sensing, triggering collective bioluminescence at a density that makes the light visible at ocean scale, is established. The organism primarily responsible is identified. The conditions that concentrate it into a Milky Sea event are documented. What remains genuinely uncertain is the frequency of events that go unobserved, the full geographic range of the phenomenon at the sensitivity of current detection instruments, the precise ecological role of bioluminescence at this scale, and the degree to which Milky Sea events influence the organisms living in and around the bloom during the event. These are interesting open questions. They are the kind that draw researchers back to a phenomenon rather than the kind that leave a phenomenon unexplained in any fundamental sense. The Milky Sea is still being examined. It is still yielding information. It is the kind of thing that rewards looking. The coast of Socotra, that group of islands at the mouth of the Gulf of Aden, rocky and remote, with a unique flora and a position directly in the path of the monsoon wind, sits near the heart of the Milky Sea zone. The waters around Socotra are among the most documented Milky Sea waters in the world. The waters that appear most frequently in the logbook accounts that Miller's team cataloged, the waters that produced some of the most sustained events in the historical record. On any given August night, the water east and south of Socotra holds the warmth and the dissolved organic matter and the bacterial populations that are the preconditions for a Milky Sea event. Whether a bloom is active on any specific night, whether the population has reached the density threshold required for quorum sensing to trigger collective light production, whether the conditions have persisted long enough and the bacterial population has grown dense enough, these are matters the ocean is determining continuously in its usual terms of chemistry and temperature and time. The ocean does not announce when an event is beginning. It does not signal when the threshold is crossed. The glow appears in the dark, uniformly across whatever area the bloom has spread to, and it persists until the bacterial population declines, until the nutrients are exhausted, or the calm water is disturbed by wind that mixes the surface layer, or the bloom is disrupted by some shift in ocean conditions that the surface does not record in any visible way. And then the glow is gone, the water is dark again, the bloom disperses, the bacteria die or distribute themselves back through the water column in densities too low to produce visible light. The ocean surface returns to its ordinary nighttime darkness and leaves no mark. What remains after a Milky Sea event is the account of it, if anyone was present to make one, a ship's logbook entry, a position coordinate with sea condition notes, a contemporary written account filed by a yacht crew, a set of satellite radiance readings stored in a data archive on a server in Colorado. The event itself leaves nothing physical, no residue, no visible trace, nothing that would allow an observer arriving at the same location the following week to determine that anything unusual had occurred there. The light was there, and then the light was not there, and the ocean between those two states is identical in appearance. This absence of physical evidence is not unique to the Milky Sea among documented natural phenomena. It is, however, particularly complete in this case. An aurora leaves no mark on the atmosphere after it fades. A waterspout leaves no trace on the ocean surface after it dissipates. A Milky Sea leaves nothing, no bleaching of the water, no unusual chemistry detectable at the surface by eye, no change in the texture or color of the water in daylight that would indicate the previous night's display. What the sailors who encountered these events carried forward was not a sample, not a physical artifact, not anything that could be examined in a laboratory. What they carried forward was language, the specific, carefully chosen language of a logbook entry written in the middle watch by a professional observer trying to set down what was in front of them precisely enough that it could be understood by someone who had not been there. The language survives in archives. The sea that produced it does not survive, except as the same warm, productive, bacterial-rich water that produced it then and is capable of producing it again. There is something particular about this, the complete disappearance of the physical event and the survival of the record, that makes the Milky Sea an unusually pure example of how natural phenomena at the edge of ordinary experience are transmitted through time. The VOC navigator, who wrote about white fire extending across the full breadth of the visible horizon in the mid-17th century, had no way to bring the event home. He had his logbook, He brought the logbook. 4 centuries later, the logbook, or a copy of it, or a transcription of the relevant entry, sits in the database of the same research literature that contains the satellite radiance maps from 2019. The light he saw and the light the satellite detected are not the same light. They are the same kind of light, produced by the same species, by the same mechanism, in the same region of ocean, under the same seasonal conditions. In the early morning hours, before the sky begins to lighten in the east, the Suomi NIMPP satellite completes another orbital pass over the Arabian Sea. Its altitude is approximately 824 kilometers above the ocean surface, a distance that places it well above the atmosphere's densest layers, in a polar orbit that takes it over every part of the Earth's surface approximately 14 times each day. The day/night band sensor on the satellite does not rest between passes. It continues to record ocean surface radiance at every point along its orbital track, building a nightly record of what the ocean surface is emitting in terms of faint light at a sensitivity that can resolve features that would have been below the noise floor of any previous instrument. As the satellite's orbital track carries it southeast across the Arabian Sea before dawn, the day/night band reads whatever the water below it is doing, dark or faintly, persistently luminous.